our participants, but we do have live streaming happening on our YouTube channel. And any questions that any of our participants have today, please do use the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session, and throughout we will be attending to those questions and bringing those through to the conversation. So get those questions ready. We're very excited to have you all with us. We're very excited to have our speakers with us. We expect this to be a great webinar over the next hour. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Michelle Horsfield, who leads our transition work in our standards program, who will present to us on our white paper on financing credible transitions. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Justine. My name is Michelle Horsfield. I lead the transition program work within climate bonds, and I want to talk to you about a little bit of the detail from the paper we published in September. I want to kick off just by asking the question, really, why we're talking about transition. It's important that to meet the climate goals, we will need whole economies to move to net zero emissions. And historically, the green bond market has been dominated by renewable energy, buildings, transport and water infrastructure. But the key sectors and companies that need to decarbonise are not yet active at scale. And that's really why we're starting to expand our work into to new sectors, to really pick up other sectors. Our first step was publishing a proposal to market, a white paper called Financing Credible Transitions. It's about transition in the real world and the implications for finance. The focus is very much on climate mitigation and decarbonisation. The paper has three purposes, really. It is a framework for all the different types and dimensions of transition. It gives a set of principles that guide to make sure that we avoid greenwashing accusations. And it gives a proposal for how a transition label might be used. The first two are obviously the most important, because what we care about here is that transition happens at the speed and the scale and the depth that we need to ensure the goals of the Paris Agreement. There are three key features, I think, to any transition. The first is that it must be ambitious. The underlying goal here is Paris. This is not about a little bit better than last year. It's not even about improvement, even if that's substantial. It has got to be tied to the goals of Paris, net zero by 2050. Secondly, it must be inclusive. And this is where I really get excited, because it is a framework for everybody. There is space for the traditionally green, but also those new sectors that have not traditionally played, certainly in the green bond space. Thirdly, it needs to be flexible. Our history, obviously, with bonds, but I think the proposals that we put forward here are broad enough to encompass all kinds of finance. It's not just about bonds. The paper put forward a categorisation. And I think this is hugely important. It feels like a complex slide, but if you focus at the middle, sort of turquoisey blue, those 5 categories are a really good way of starting to understand what each kind of activity is going to need. It ensures that we talk clearly about different types of transition. And of course, it doesn't leave anyone out. Everyone has to transition in some way. I'll go on now to give some examples to explain this, because it's often quite hard to get your head around first off. So my first example is that first one, that pathway to zero. For example, cement production. Now, transition here means decarbonising the activity as fast as possible, And at the top there are some decarbonisation measures that you might do if you were a cement producer. Change the energy source, enhance the production process. But over time, the activity itself would shift to becoming low carbon cement production, and eventually a whole company could be a low carbon cement producer. The nature of transition means that there is lots of fundamental change that will happen for everybody. My next example is an interim activity, an interim category. I give the example here of operating a gas network. Transitioning here is a bit different. It's about phasing out that activity in line with their future sunset date. But in the meantime, decarbonising as fast as possible. Initially, in the green circle there, it might just be to stop the fugitive emissions, to those decarbonisation measures. But over time, perhaps to upgrade that network so that it can take hydrogen. Eventually, operating a gas network might look at hydrogen storage facilities so that the entity itself shifts from being an operator of a gas network to a low carbon energy distributor. It's a fundamental shift. This is recognising, of course, that gas doesn't really have a role in the long term, but there are measures that can be taken whilst it is still in service. My third example is a stranded asset. So operation of a coal-fired power station, for example. Now, transition here means phasing out these activities with immediate effect, but at the same time, taking any measures that can deliver substantial emissions reductions. And the key here is avoiding lock-in. So again, some early decarbonisation measures might mean that the company looks at acquiring some wind farms, eventually to decommission the fossil fuel generation so that they eventually become a low carbon power producer. The key here is the switch must be rapid enough. There were 5 categories. I don't have time to go through them all, but just briefly to say for the other categories, the no pathway to zero is to reduce emissions as much as possible. And there will also be some enabling activities. These were on the right of that first slide. And these are activities that, that may help to shift the transition. And I've given an example here of hydrogen. It may be something that is not yet widely available, but we will need as an economy to transition. I come on now to talk about 5 principles to protect against greenwashing. We're very aware that this is a new area for many, and in order that it doesn't become a kind of wild west, we need to have some structures and sort of principles that guide how this should work. The first one is that it should be in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory. Secondly, established by science. Third one is that offsets don't count, and I'm quite happy to talk with anyone who wishes to discuss this more. But this is very much about the need to count your own actions and also not to count scope 3 downstream emissions because they're out with your control. The fourth one here is that it should really be about what's available technologically. And if it's a little bit expensive, that's not enough of a reason to not adopt the technology that is there. And we put that in really because we feel that, for example, with renewables, we have seen that with the right support and policy, the costs for renewables have plummeted over the last decade. The fifth one is critical. It should be not just promises or pledges. This is about the need to really be performing and show the will to continue to perform. It's about demonstrating the measures that are in place and how you will measure them over time. I want to briefly touch now on some of this guidance that can be applied to different kind of financial instruments. In those examples I gave, we talked a bit about decarbonisation measures, and they can be funded, financed by use of proceeds bonds, asset-backed securities, or green loans. The low carbon activities and eventually whole entities could also be financed from some of the newer options that people are starting to talk about. It could be through equity, sustainability linked bonds or loans, or even general purpose bonds. For us, this is very much new territory, moving beyond the traditional use of proceeds bonds, but looking at whether we can certify whole entities for those companies that have got an entire entity level strategy, because this we feel is very much what investors want, and can move and support to companies who have really got a good, well thought out strategy. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what it is that climate bonds is going to do in this space. So I set out here some of the work that we plan over the next few years. Firstly, we want to expand our well-regarded standard and certification scheme to certify not just use of proceeds bonds, but other instruments too for these high-emitting sectors and the enabling technologies. We want to move to certify companies and whole entities. We will, of course, be providing many of the tools to market that you're so fond of, particularly some of the databases we will be expanding to give you the information and the tools necessary to make decisions. And lastly, we also have a piece of work looking at supporting policymakers and regulators, both for taxonomy, but also general advice, because we realise that it's good to have some of these financial mechanisms, but it's essential really to have the policies that support and facilitate those. This is a summary of our transition programme. We feel very much that what's needed here is high standards for transition, and that it should not be a backdoor. But of course, it's essential. All of this will be essential. And I want to conclude with a quote from one of my favourite ladies, Christiana Figueres, who many of you know, the Costa Rican, who largely navigated the Paris Agreement. And she gave this urgent call to action. She says, "This decade is a moment of choice, unlike any we have ever faced. And we need stubborn optimism to change the reality we have into the reality we want." Thank you.
I think that's my cue to come in. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Thanks, Michelle. I'd like to invite my other panelists to turn on the cameras and join the session, if I can get them to come in. We've got first Eric Nitsch from Manulife, who is head of ESG Asia head of ESG in Asia. Manulife is a huge investor in Asia and globally. It's originally an insurance fund, a big asset management side. It's also, you'll be interested to know, an issuer of a certified climate bond in the past, and we might see more of those coming forward. Eric will talk from the investor perspective. Thanks for joining us, Eric. We also have our good friend Vuchi Zung. We've got a spelling mistake on the name there. We need to fix up team. But who's the Director General of International Cooperation Department of the Securities Commission of Vietnam. And I have to say, one of the architects of the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum Green Bond Guidelines, and one of the original pioneers of green finance in the ASEAN region. We're very privileged to have you here today, Zung. And then, of course, finally, we have Emma Srimartini from Pertamina, who has a long and illustrious history in promoting sustainable investments. Previously at a job with SMI, the Indonesian Development Bank, and now at Pertamina, where we're going to hear more about what she's doing here. And I have to say, it's so exciting that Pertamina got her in to this role. It's an indicator of changes afoot. Pertamina is the archetypal challenge for transition that we need to get to. You know the background. We have significant environmental challenges. We have significant changes in the global economy that's happening as a result of now 110, soon to be 112 countries committing to net zero targets for 2050, committing to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, of which, of course, ASEAN countries are signatories to as well, with really good reasons, because ASEAN is one of the most exposed regions of the planet when it comes to the impact of climate change. It may not have caused it, but it's certainly going to feel the impact. And we're going to get a lot of impact in everything from sea level rises to pandemics. This pandemic is clearly a result of degraded ecosystems leading to pathogens jumping between species. It's a kind of climate crisis. It's an example of how impacts are going to be volatile, not linear. So we need to prepare. We need to prepare resilience, and we need to prepare transitions. The world is going to change. Whatever we might think, we need to stay ahead of that wave of change. And ideally, in terms of meeting our global commitments, try and drive that change adequately, rapidly. The IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2018, laid out what we need to do. And look, it's tough. But we need things like steel. We need things like cement. We need things like plastics of a certain sort. How do we deliver those? Because they're currently very high carbon. How do we shift towards the kind of low carbon future that we need to have? That's what transition is about. You've heard Michelle talk about the parameters beforehand. Now, in the ASEAN space, we have a mixture of local, as Asian, and international investors playing a big role. Eric, you've been working in this space for a very long time. Give us your thoughts about how Manulife is looking at transitions and also what you're looking for in this space.
Thanks, Sean, and it's really a pleasure to be here today, and thanks to the whole CBI team. It's great to hear from Michelle, and thanks to Justine and also Quinn and Cedric who helped to set this up. I think, Sean, I think you really struck on a issue that we view as very important for Asia. So we've got a large footprint in Asia with teams on the ground in 11 different markets. And, Asia is a region that already represents more than 50% of the global emissions. And, with the with the exciting growth that makes it such a compelling space to invest in, it's also going to represent about 2/3 of the energy demand over the next 20 years. As Michelle was saying, two decades that are absolutely critical for the transition and for mitigating climate change. And so, that transition is going to require a lot of capital and a lot of investment. And, I think there's some really exciting momentum. So, following the net zero pledges from a number of countries in the region, I think there's now a gap between the where we are today and those pledge goals, and that's exactly where the investment opportunities lie. And so, unfortunately, that's not yet where we're seeing a lot of the investment. So according to a recent Morningstar survey, only 4.7% of the sustainable assets invested globally are in the region, even though this is where we really need to be financing that transition. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and as investors, we're really looking to support that transition.
You're on mute, Sean.
This is the most common term in the English language now. You're on mute. The side effects of Zoom. Eric, can I just ask you, what do you see as the opportunities coming ahead of you at the moment? So what's the landscape look like? Give us a bit of a flavour of what you're looking at from the point of view of an investor. I mean, are you investing in Pertamina, for example?
I would have to check, but I think looking at the the opportunities, across the region. Last year we saw, I think one is just the growth in sustainable labeled products, and I think that's really kind of coming into its own as an asset class that's bringing a lot of opportunity. So in Asia Pacific in 2020, there's about 110 billion of green bond issuance. That was up more than double from 48 billion 5 years ago in 2016, and multitudes bigger than only a few billion before that. So I think that in itself is very exciting. We see a depth and breadth in that market that's developing. So I think there's new issuance coming from different sectors, more issuance from high yield and different parts of the market, and then also new innovative types of instruments. So not just transition bonds, but also blue bonds and KPI linked sustainability bonds, and so I think that's one area that we see as quite compelling.
You're right, it's really grown, hasn't it? I mean, Zung, perhaps I can go to you now. You must be very proud of the work you did at the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum all those years ago, which has blossomed into an ASEAN sustainable bonds market. It's extraordinary, the growth of the last few years. Can you, well, first, thank you for that work. Tell us where you think we are now and what the next developments are from a regulatory and a policy perspective.
Thank you, Sean. I continue the word from Eric about opportunity. So regulators are finding the opportunity to cooperate to recover and reduce the private sector, and private sector are finding the opportunity for the investor. So we need someone to bridge the demand, the capital demand from the investment, and also demand for the investment from private sector. And from the regulatory point of view, so we are working on the policy, and we harmonize the rules, and the rules of the financial markets, and also rules of other sectors. And at the ASEAN level, we harmonize the rules and harmonize the standards of different member states of ASEAN. And for ASEAN regulators, we have been working on green issues. And thanks to the introduction of Justin about the endorsement of the financial minister of the setting up the taxonomy board for ASEAN, which is good progress, and for ASEAN and also for ASEAN capital market regulators. We did start with the action plan from 2016 to 2020, and now is the second phase from 21 to 25. So the endorsement of the financial minister of ASEAN is also the good start for us to work on the action plan and the endorsement of the action plan of ASEAN capital market regulators for the next 5 years. And taxonomy is the important one, and also transition bond is the very first step initiative for ASEAN regulators to work on the policy. And also we also get in the engagement of the private sector, comments and opinions from private sector, whether it is the policy the feature we work on, it is applicable, it's okay for the market. So it is the bridging between the policy and reality. And yeah, that for the CBI, the white paper, and we see some similarities, we observe it, and you know that one of the key priorities of the action plan for next 5 years of ASEAN capital market regulators is to foster the growth and recovery with prosperity, and promoting and sustaining inclusive, so doing also the the policies and doing also the facilitating the investment of the ASEAN investors and also non-ASEAN investors into ASEAN as an asset class and also as a green asset class for its investment. And yeah, we do have the focus on sustainable finance and taxonomy, and that is we observe EU taxonomy. We observe the initiatives of different regions, and we also observe the demand of the green capital demand of the ASEAN market, so that we have the policies to meet all the demand from the international investors and also ASEAN investors into the green assets. So that's what the ASEAN capital market regulators are working on in terms of the broader views of the ASCO, which Asia Pacific, where we do have also the report by ASCO, which ASEAN member state also contribute to the report. So it is supporting capital finance and combine all the efforts of different sectors, different regulators in the region for the same goal. And so narrow down to the Vietnamese circumstance. And I'm happy to first announce that in next Monday, we will launch in Vietnam the green bond, social bonds, and subsidy bonds guidelines. So how to issue the guidelines, and thanks to the CBI for the support to have the SSC to develop this guideline. So it is in line ASEAN's green and social bond and subsidy bond standard, and also the EU taxonomy. And also the focus is still on the transition bond. And ASEAN regulators, we are aware of the importance of transition bond. Not over time we can reach the goal, but we have to work to the goal. And it is fast enough, then we can run with the support of institutions like CBI. So I think it is a kind of drop a book for that.
This is fantastic. What fantastic news. You heard it here. Next week, the launch of the new guidelines in Vietnam. We will see the flowering of a market with the support from the Securities Commission and other government bodies. Emma Srimartini, you've now heard, of course, Zung as a representative of ASEAN regulators get enthusiastic about this, really. It's interesting, isn't it? And you've seen the development of this market. In fact, you've been active in your previous role in having a green sukuk issued in the Indonesian market. Tell us a bit about what transition looks like it means for Pertamina and the nature of the ambition, if you can.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I think, yeah, it's interesting to know how that Vietnam is really quite advanced in this green market, I think. So congratulations to you, Mr. Zung. I think in Indonesian context, if we are talking about regulatory framework, I think our OJK as FSA, Financial Services Authority, has been establishing the green bond framework for the local green bond issuance since few years back. I think if I remember correctly, probably it was issued at the 2017 few years back, yeah. And the company that I'm previously working for is becoming the first corporate who has been issuing green bond framework. But yes, that we need to admit that Indonesian context is not really that quiet happening for the green bond issuance. I think for many other aspects, I believe, and for the national energy mix policy, I think government already established the national energy mix policy that we are targeting to reach the renewable energy sectors is representing almost 22% in the next 20 years down the road for the 2030. So, and there would be shifting from fossil fuel to the renewable energy down to around 7 to 9% from fuel to renewable energy sectors. When it comes to Pertamina, where Pertamina, our core business is still pretty much dominated by fossil fuel. Our revenue contributions is still dominated by fossil fuel revenue, and coming from revenue from renewable energy is still representing very small numbers. I think it's quite less than 5% currently in our revenue proportion. But in our master plan for the next 5 years down the road, we are targeting to reach revenue contributions coming from renewable energy sectors is almost 10 to 15% out of total revenue profile. I think this is pretty much driven by our commitment to support renewable energy sectors, mostly dominated by geothermal, because we do establish our subsidiary. They are focusing on power and new and renewable energy sectors, and they do have a lot of capacity. We do have capacity in terms of geothermal capacity, almost 1.2 gigawatts. And from any other sectors of renewable energy sectors, almost 5.5 gigawatts coming from solar, from water, and from any other renewable energy sectors as well. So I think if we are talking about the potential that Pertamina know, we do have a lot of potential that we are preparing ourselves to shifting our fossil fuel and then preparing for more focusing on the renewable energy and green energy. I myself is very big fans of SDG number 7, right? So clean energy is probably becoming our goals as well in Pertamina in the current context, yeah, because we are realize that sunset of fuel will be happening in the next 30 or 40 years down the road. So I think, like it or not, we are ourselves have to be preparing to enter into the energy transition period, and then Pertamina is quite ready for that because we are already establishing our subsidiary that will be focusing on renewable energy as well as for the energy transitions. So if we are talking about the domestic resources, also we are trying to optimizing the domestic resources while we are in the process of transitions to facing the zero carbon in the next 2050. That's
folks, you heard it here from Sri Martini. Pertamina is focusing on clean energy. How about that? This is a giant of the fossil fuel industry in Indonesia who has seen a different future. And that's really worth mentioning. Now, of course, we can have discussions and arguments even about the speed of that transition, the nature of the risks and so on. That's the fun part of transitions. We need to have that discussion and to examine. But the fact that you're moving in this direction and your ambitious plans around geothermal and other renewables is fantastic. Look, can I ask you, just a secret for us all, do you think we'll see a Pertamina bond for geothermal? Is this possible?
Yes, of course. I think, in fact, that if we can share with all of you, I think specifically addressed to you, Pak Eric. So you have to get ready for this one. Because I think geothermal for the green investor is, it's pretty much, dominated and the most preferable one because it's really dark green, right? So I think in the next, if not this year, probably in the next upcoming year, we are planning to issue our green bond for the geothermal. But in fact, it's not only for geothermal because now we are replacing our energy consumptions to becoming more green energy. So probably becoming a solar panel as well as any other more green energy to replace our fuel energy. So I think this is something that probably will be becoming underlying for the not only for the green bond but probably for the transition bond as well. So not only for the energy but only for any other utilities energy sector as well. So looking forward to having Manulife becoming our bondholder then.
Well, I look forward to hearing the news of a productive conversation between the two of you. But the key point for everyone out there, for our listeners, is we need to bring our fossil fuel companies into a new area. We need to bring the staff, the people that depend on those incomes into a new economy. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not slow. We don't have 60 years to do this. We are facing changes that will force these transitions anyway, but we really need to do it for our environment, to protect it. What Pertamina is doing is exactly the right. Of course, Sri Martini, I hope you'll forgive me if I push you to do more. That is the nature of our job at an NGO, of course, and to see how fast we can make you transition and how fast we can make the Indonesian economy and the Vietnamese economy transition. I mean, Zung, in Vietnam, we've seen some extraordinary developments over the last 2 years of the rollout of solar energy. It's unbelievable. And in a workshop a couple of days ago that we did with some of your colleagues in other ministries, there was lots of talk about this. I mean, this has changed the story very much in terms of what transition looks like in Vietnam, doesn't it? And tell us a little bit more about what the other sectors of transition you're thinking about in Vietnam is, in property and in transport and so on. What do you think is on the agenda? What's the government looking at trying to change? Mute, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Sean, for this question. And the Vietnam government is committed to change. Because you know that firstly, we have a very long coastal line. And we are agricultural country. And we are also the neighboring country. So the need for the capital for the development of the transportation and for the any agricultural production and also for the fishery production. So all these needs are also at a management, or is very much dependent on the environment and climate change. So we do see the other need for the to accelerate the clean energy transition. And the government is working to lower the environment footprint of the country growth and effectively to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so not only the policy, but also the government the budget expenditure for this one, for investment into this one. So for this investment, the government also working on the green bond issue and plan for green bond issue. And so it's the first time to come the commitment of the government for this one, and the government working on the policy to facilitate the investment and investment into the new energy and renewable energy and for the economy. And of course, we have to manage it in the development and environment protection. We do have the key strategies of the government, Vietnamese government, key strategies and plans to stimulate green growth and sustainable use of the natural assets for this one. And for the capital market, also we are working on transparency for the investors who wish to invest into the green financial products, and transparency for the foreign investors. And also it's also good for the issuers and the companies who wish to issue green bonds and transition bonds. We have been working on the introduction of transition bonds into this market, and we also do have the knowledge improvement and training for the non-financial institutions, non-financial companies for issue the bond, and our government is aims to promote green and sustainable economic growth. And the government is working on the 10-year strategy for green growth. So those are the policies and showing the commitment of the Vietnamese government for for the climate mitigation of the risk of the climate change impact on the Vietnamese economy. And we do see the need for financing the green agenda of the Vietnamese government. So the transition bond and green product issuance is very important to mobilize the funding sources for the investment in this green agenda.
So we can expect a lot of activity going forward. It's interesting that you note that you're looking for domestic investors, but you're also looking for international investors. In the past, in Vietnam, there's been an emphasis on developing domestic capital markets, but you specifically highlighted the interest in international investment. So Eric, I think that's a cue to you to say, first, any reactions to what's been said, but also a little bit more about the kind of things you're looking for. What are the parameters for you in these scale, currency? Do you have appetite for Vietnamese or Indonesian currency? Is it going to be hard currency, and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, you know, for us specifically at Manulife, we do have both local currency and US dollar strategies, and so, you know, I think that can be helpful. You know, I think in many ways it goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about the depth and breadth of the market, and so, you know, to a certain extent, when they're large issuers and you know, quite liquid instruments, that helps quite a bit. That can be helpful, you know, but it's also helpful to get issuance from various sectors and you know, some smaller issuers or you know, a issuance that allows us to diversify, you know, when we're building a portfolio. And so yeah, you know, I think the key is that you know, it just continues to the market continues to grow and broaden,
which is good news for Pertamina, Emma. In Pertamina's case, some of your colleagues around the world, in terms of the private oil companies, have been making very strong commitments to being net zero by 2050, you know, to varying degrees. You know, there's been some criticism of some of them. There's too much planting trees and not enough changing the sectors, whereas other companies, perhaps like BP, have seen very strong commitments to change, all being examined still. Is this something that Pertamina's looking at? Do you see this as a direction for Pertamina to adopt the model that's being used in some of the overseas entities?
Yes, I think Pertamina ourselves also is preparing to heading to that directions, of course, because I think it's now becoming the global trend, whereby whether it is NOC or IOC also facing towards that directions. But given the domestic resources that we do have, which is fossil fuel as well as the coal, which is quite abundant in our country, I think we try to make it balanced in terms of how that we can optimize the domestic resources. Meanwhile, we are preparing ourselves in parallel to that directions, whereby geothermal also we do have a lot of reserve. 1/3 of global reserve is reside in Indonesian's location. So I think for us as a Pertamina, we try to make it balanced. We try to optimize for the fossil fuel, and in parallel to that, we try to boosting and promoting the renewable energy as well as geothermal. Like I mentioned earlier in the beginning, whereby in the next 5 years, that our national energy mix will be becoming lowering down to around 25, yeah, for the fossil fuel, originally coming from 33% out of total national energy mix. So again, this is something that it's happening also in Indonesian context, whereby we are heading to that toward directions, but also trying to optimizing the domestic resources, and then it happens also in Pertamina case, yeah.
I guess that's a question back to you, Eric, too. Thank you, Emma. How much are you looking for that too? I mean, to take a couple of variations on transition bonds, one approach to transition bonds is a company like Pertamina issues bonds to finance geothermal. But the second transition that's been talked about, particularly in, say, steel companies, is if you've got a 10-year plan to achieve zero carbon, a bit longer than the usual time frame for a green bond, and it's a solid plan, would you then back the company as being a transition? Can you see Manulife getting to that stage? Which then begs the question of, does that mean you would start looking or asking of the likes of Pertamina for an ambitious overall corporate strategy of transition as well? How do you think this is moving?
I think this is actually quite important, and it's something that we already do in many regards. So, like you said, if you have a use of proceeds based instrument, to a certain extent, you can get comfortable that if the project is green, then you know that your financing is supporting that project. We think looking at the overall issuing entity is critically important also, because what we don't want to do is support a green project and then allow that to free up room on the balance sheet to further expand the fossil fuel business in other parts of the company. And I know that's something that CBI considers in, when evaluating use of proceeds instruments also. But I do think that is important, and I think it's doubly important because these sustainable debt instruments for us as investors are, can really be ways that, tools that we have to address climate risk in the portfolios. And so if the it should be something that's facilitating the overall transition of the issuing company. And that's especially important when you're considering credit risk, because if there is climate risk at the company level, it's really the same credit that's oftentimes backing both instruments. So I think that's very important. Now, when you clearly have a credible ambition and plan set by a company, we're also very happy to back that at the issuer level. So if it's not a use of proceeds bond, if it's a transition bond that's funding general corporate purposes, I think that's great, and I think that provides some added flexibility to the company. But that's where you really get down to the transition principles that were mentioned earlier, because as asset managers, we're under a lot of pressure from our investors, the asset owners, to show that transition and that those targets are credible. And so, it's really got to be based in the science. It's got to be transparent and backed by action. And so those are the things that we look for and evaluate when a new issuance comes to market.
So I think we've got a lot to talk about this for Pertamina, because it looks like there's big opportunities here to do something. But Eric, one last question for you. What are you looking for from regulators? We have one of the world's leading regulators on camera now, Zoom in Vietnam, and very influential in ASEAN. What do you want from him? And from his peers in terms of steps that might improve tradability, that might improve liquidity? What are you looking for?
Yeah,
I think. Oh, sorry, please.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, it's addressed to you. Sorry.
So Eric, but Emma, I will be interested to hear from you as well. So Eric first.
Sure. So I think the key word here is harmonization, and so I think there's a lot of really great work going on, really around the world, but also in in ASEAN and in our region, around taxonomy, around standards. But as a global investor, we it's really helpful when those are consistent, and I think that they should be consistent, because if they're all grounded in the underlying science, then they should it should lead to consistency. but when we have portfolios at the single country level, at a regional level, at a global level, and we're managing across jurisdictions, it's really helpful for there to be harmonization across those standards.
And I think, Zung, you're already thinking hard about that. You mentioned earlier the EU taxonomy and others. Are we right in thinking that?
Right. Thank you, Sean and Eric. And harmonization is the key word for ASEAN or regulators. More than 3 years ago, when we worked on the green bond standard, and we observed the ICMA green bond standard, and we work on standards so that it is it's okay, it's suitable for the ASEAN member state situation. And also for taxonomy, we are also observe the EU taxonomy. And the harmonization is very important. And I agree with Eric that a foreign investor want to see, okay, now the standard is as in the international standard. And also the interpretation of these standards is understandable for foreign investor, outside ASEAN investor into ASEAN and into each of the ASEAN member states. So also harmonization of the rules among ASEAN member states, financial rules and also the regulatory rules, and to facilitate the understanding of the market, and also seeing ASEAN as an asset class and ASEAN as a community, a single community for one investment. So don't looking into 10 members, 10 different requirements and taxonomy. And also for ASEAN point of view, we don't want to see 10 taxonomies of the 10 members. We want to a single taxonomy with harmonized rules. So to adapt the single taxonomy of ASEAN, harmonized rules among 10 member states to facilitate foreign investment.
You've got some challenges ahead of you. So I've got an interesting
Right.
question that's appeared in the Q&A, and there's a question perhaps for Eric as well. For local pension funds in the ASEAN region, which of course critical to the health of the stock markets, how should they shift? Should they be shifting really quickly? What would you as a regulator want them to do in terms of better prepare for the risks of climate change and the risks of transition and so on? What sort of frameworks? Perhaps Zung and then Eric, just a comment on that question. What's your advice to pension funds?
Okay. Eric, can you go back on me?
Eric, why don't you start us off?
Sure, Zung, please go ahead. I can start. So I think as an asset manager, we manage money for pension funds, and so I think it's I think these are really important issues for pension funds to be considering. The good news is I think that they are, but from our perspective, I think we believe we have a responsibility to offer them solutions. So I think that it's there are challenges that they're facing, and as asset managers, we can help provide solutions for how to manage those challenges. And so I think we really welcome conversations with the pension funds that we work with about these topics.
Yeah, I agree with Eric, and it is for the pension fund and also manage within the benefit for the fund, and also both benefits for the fund and the environment. So it's up to the pension managers for this one. And so the pension fund, we think that is more conservative than others, because make sure that sustain the benefits for the fund, together with the benefits for the environment, and also looking into the standard, labeling the financial products they want to invest in, and filing the first party and second opinion to verify this one. So very being the not really the part in these green investments, but being more careful investor into these financial products.
I mean, underpinning all of this is a risk understanding of how we're transitioning. You know, we've seen already the impact of dramatic state government action in Europe and in China on the energy industry, and what that meant for now very cheap solar, for example, which is changing the energy dynamics in ASEAN as a result. With the 110 countries now committed to much tougher climate goals than they were looking at two years ago, we can expect many more policy-driven changes to be coming through. As we're thinking about ASEAN economies, we need to be thinking about that, what that looks like in advance. What's going to mean to Pertamina's business plan when vehicles sold across ASEAN become electric in the next 10 years as a result of major policy changes in China and Europe, and of course corporate changes now in the US, which are driving down the cost of electric vehicles. That's got to flow on a peg. So the transition is not just a matter of looking to respond to purely environmental objectives, it's also responding to the way the world is going to shift very, very quickly as a result of a gathering momentum of support for acting on the Paris Agreement goals. So it's complicated, Emma, and I'm sure you're in the middle of it now. But I want to ask you, we need to wrap up, everyone. I'm looking for a quick final comment. But Emma, I want to ask you, is there something you're looking for specifically from your regulators to help you in the thinking and the development of your work in Pertamina while we have Zong in front of us?
Yeah, I think from the regulatory perspective also, Pertamina is one of the issuing probably green bond or transition bond. I think we need to be supported by the regulator in terms of the incentive mechanism. I think, yeah, this is in Indonesian context, because most of the issuing company perceive that once they are willing to issue the green bond or transition bond, they will cause additional cost for them, whereby they need to get certified, whereby they need to hire another consultant and all that. So is there something that probably regulator can do about it and can provide some sort of incentive to be motivating all the issuing company to issue and to persuade green bond or transition bond? And that's on the regulatory perspective on the capital market side. On the sectoral side, I think this is something that we need to be supported also by the regulator in this case, in our case, from the Ministry of Energy. Yes, that we do establish our business plan for the next 5 years. Actually, we already established Indonesian Battery Holding Company with any other SOE. So this is one of our preparations that we are facing to the next energy vehicle that will be replacing fossil fuel consumption. So I think this is already in our business plan already incorporated in our master plan anyway.
Fantastic. Another backing for transition and green bonds in the future. We're going to see a lot from Pertamina, I think, Zong and Eric. Zong, final words, advice to our listeners about transition. What would you say?
Now it's time to work on the framework for the transition bond. It's for the emerging market, especially for ASEAN countries, and it's time for the individual member states to guide the market towards the transition bond by giving the policy guidelines, by supporting the issues as the Indonesia single tax incentive. We have to support not only by policy, but also something is beneficial for the company in very short term. So that's work on the incentive. Thank you.
Fantastic. And it's worth noting that the Chinese central bank has discount wholesale capital available, liquidity lending window of the central bank if you post green bonds as collateral. That could be a cool incentive for some of the central banks in the region. But look, we'll leave that for another webinar. Just picking up Emma's point. Eric, final points for you, our advice to our listeners.
Sure. I think I would just start with thank you to the other panelists, to the Bu Martini and Mr. Zhang, and really to the CBI. I think this. I was really pleased to see this white paper come out and these principles be released, because I think the transition is really important, but transitions can it can be a controversial topic, and I think it's one that really needs credibility, and so I think having that basis in the science, having the the need for that, being able to express that ambition and the greater ambition that we need in a really credible way is really important. So I think it's it's great to see all this work going on.
Thank you. Sri Martini, a last word from the archetypal transition company of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I think this is just to giving all the investor and the green investor that I think Pertamina established our subsidiary that will be focusing on new and renewable energy. One of the things is geothermal, and it's stated in their master plan for the next 5 years. It will requires around 14 billion US dollar to achieving their target up to 40 gigawatts. And 50% out of it is coming from geothermal and new renewable energy sector. So I think it's very huge opportunity for all the green investors in the global. Thank you.
And I
Thank
think
you again
that's
for CBI.
Thank you. I think that's the mantra for our session. There is a huge opportunity here, a huge opportunity for investors, a huge opportunity for issuers, and a huge opportunity for our steerage of the planet to address climate change. You've asked many questions in the Q&A. We haven't been able to answer them live. For offsets, look at our financial credible transitions paper to understand our argument about offsets. It's posted in the chat. If you're interested in the transition categories, look at the climate bonds discussion about transitions and about taxonomies. If you're concerned about small enterprises and small businesses and how we take advantage of it, it's a separate discussion. But we will get to that because it is a really important issue about how we bridge the gap between small companies and large capital markets and large bonds. And there are many other questions too. Nuclear for another day. What does it look like, in other words? The main thing is work has started. It started here in this conversation. It started with the regulators a few days ago in ASEAN, who nominated a taxonomy board and talked about transition strategies. And you've heard about the work that Pertamina is doing. Of course, there are many companies and organizations and governments in ASEAN doing this work. Don't get me wrong, the job is immense. The job is huge. What we have to change in the next few years is extraordinary, but it has started. Join us in delivering the kind of world we want our children to live in ASEAN, which is what this is all about fundamentally. Thank you so much to first Justine Liebel and Michelle Horsfield from Climate Bonds, but then most importantly to Vishu Zung from the International Cooperation Department of the Securities Commission, to Emma Sri Martini, who's the Director of Finance, I forgot to mention that before, my apologies, from PT Pertamina, and of course Eric Nitsch from Head of ESG Asia, and Manulife, one of the heroes of green finance investing around the world. Keep working, everyone. We'll see you again in this space. We'll be having more discussions over coming months. Stay